Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 4 game from the Reykjavik Open. Now, if you followed the round 3 video, you know I won a marathon of a game, 102 moves, very up and down tussle, fortunate to win, but I won in the end, and it was a feel-good moment. After 6 hours of persistence, I got it done, and I was actually playing down again. Now, again, what happens in an open tournament is if you lose a game, especially with the rating that I have being around 2400, I typically need to win a few games before I actually play up again. That is the nature of an open tournament. You lose and you're playing down multiple rounds. So, in fact, I was actually playing down again against 2170, very similar to my last opponent, but again, these people are not, anything to take lightly, and I really have this motto of like no easy buckets. Actually comes from basketball, but I actually have always said it in chess too. No easy buckets. You come in that lane, you gotta expect to feel something. You're gonna expect to get some contact. And the same thing in chess. You're gonna expect some adversity. You're gonna expect a fight, and that's what I was expecting. Now I was white in this one, so I did feel like I had a little bit a better chance to get off to a really, really good start as opposed to being on the back foot with black, and I went for it. My opponent in this one was a guy named Arnt Esbensen, and I believe he's from Norway, so just for your info. But anyways, let's get into it. So I opened with d4. Arnt played d6, and I went knight f3. I've spoken before about why it's very important to play knight f3 to combat this e5 break. Again, if you play another move like c4, if you're a d4 player and you don't want to play e4. Of course, e4 would transpose to like Perk or modern type systems, but if you want to stay in d4 land, after d6 you need to play knight f3 to control e5, because if you go for a move like c4, you're actually inviting this e5 move, and this endgame, as I've discussed, is not ideal. In particular because this d4 square is really sensitive and difficult to cover, and if you play e3, then d3 is very weak. So again, these endgames are not very good for white, and that's why you stop black from playing e5, at least for the moment. So knight f3 I played, knight f6, c4, knight bd7, and now knight c3. And with knight bd7, you can't stop e5 forever, but at least with the old Indian, what you're actually going to be able to do is you're actually going to be able to play e4 if you want, before black's able to play e5 and e4. So if we back up just a second, just to point that out, if I go c4 here and then e5, yeah, I can play knight f3 and not stop, and at least challenge the e5 pawn now, but then e4 is actually a move, and even though these positions are fine for white, they're just different, and you have to be willing to play some type of reverse French or some type of structure where black actually takes a lot of space in the center. And so if you want to maintain the space advantage that you get as a white player playing a white opening, you go knight f3 and you hold up e5 for the moment, and then when they do play e5, you play e4 and you prevent them from playing e4 yourself. And so this is what I wind up doing. And we have this old Indian structure, which it's kind of funny because I lost in the structure with white a few rounds earlier in round 2 against Sergei Movsesian. So I don't know if he had seen that game. He probably did and thought, oh, I can play this one. But of course, the reason I lost that game was not necessarily because of the opening. So I was willing to go in for the system again, or the setup at least. So after bishop e7, I went g3. This was a little bit different from the way I played it before. Before I played bishop d3, and my idea with putting the bishop on d3 is that it wind up going to c2, and it just sort of eyes the f5 pawn and also covers e4. So that was my idea there, but again, I always want to be the first one to surprise, and if I go for the same line I've actually gone for in the tournament already, there is a high likelihood that he's seen it and it will improve upon that, and he would be the first one to surprise. So because of that, I want to just play a new setup with g3, and g3 has a whole set of new implications. You put the bishop on g2, it's just a whole different setup. So castles, bishop g2, c6. These are normal kind of old Indian moves. You play c6 to cover the d5 square. Also, it also gives the queen the c7 square, which is important in some lines. So just a different setup. And now I castle. and now a6. And here's probably the first critical position of the game, because a6 actually introduces this b5 idea. And in many situations, if I play a normal move, let's say rook e1, b5 is a move I have to contend with, because in addition to my c4 pawn being challenged, there's some scenarios where b4 might actually be attractive for black. And maybe not right away, because my knight can just go to a4 and blockade these pawns. But this tension is kind of annoying to deal with, and it also facilitates the development of the black bishop to b7. And if the bishop goes to b7, the queen goes to c7, one rook comes to e8, maybe another comes to c8, black has a very reasonable position and a reasonable footing in the center. I mean, he's lacking a little bit of space, but everything is kind of working in concert together, and it's kind of an interesting setup. So because of that, I want to restrict black, from taking all of that space. And that's why instead of playing rook e1, I played a4, which is really natural move. The idea is that now if b5 is played, that'd be a huge mistake, because after a takes b5, this a pawn is pinned because the rook is hitting a8. And if c takes b5, I can go c takes b5 and win a pawn, because again, the pin still stands. So that's the idea there. So after a4, there's one drawback with a4, and it's that I really chronically weaken this b4 square. Many instances, it's very attractive for a knight actually to land via a6 on b4. And then from b4, because I've also played the move c4 already, you can see that a piece on b4 is kind of unassailable. So there is a drawback to that move in terms of giving up the space. And I was very, very surprised that my opponent didn't go a5, which is typically an automatic here because you secure this b4 square. Perhaps he's reluctant to do it because the knight already moved to d7, so it seems like it's kind of far away from that square. But even if the knight doesn't occupy that square right away, it's also sometimes an option where the queen can go to b6 and b4 and kind of wreak havoc on my queen side. So I do feel like a5 is the best move, and I was a little bit surprised, pleasantly so, when I saw the move rook e8, which kind of says, you know what, I don't need to play a5, whatever. Because a5 wasn't played, I thought it would be a good opportunity to consider taking advantage of it myself. And so I actually wound up playing a5. And the point is, now that I played a5, I've taken more space on the queen side, and I've managed to potentially have some nice sensitive dark square targets for later in the game. If the pawn structure remains like this, you actually can find that this one pawn is actually controlling two, because this pawn this pawn structure here is severely limited, because I can take en passant if he tries to play b5. And on the flip side, there might be a scenario where a knight might land on b6 one day. So I thought this was a really, really important gain on the queen side, and actually worth it for me to try and seize on instead of making one of the normal moves like rook e1 or h3, which I do wind up doing later. So I thought this was a huge, huge move for me, because I thought now if he does try to liberate, I'm going to take en passant, and he has these weak squares, particularly weak pawns on a6 and c6. So black actually did play b5, and I didn't really have a problem with that, because after en passant and queen takes b6, you can see now that white has an additional pawn island on a6, whereas I actually, have one nice long pawn chain for now. And also my rook on a1 now has a lot of space, so it's kind of indirectly activated on the a line, even though it hasn't moved. So I thought this was a nice development for me. That being said, now black does have counterplay on the b file, so there are options of playing rook b8 and putting pressure down here, and my bishop on c1 is kind of frozen for the moment. I decided to play c5, which I thought was an interesting move, tactically taking advantage of the queen being on the square at the moment, because something that I was wary of is if I make a normal move, let's say h3, this is a normal prophylactic move to stop knight g4, or sometimes even bishop g4. If e takes d4, knight takes d4, and knight c5, it seems like this knight is a pretty decent outpost on c5, and it's not going to be challenged really, because black will wind up playing a5 to secure the b4 square. And after a move like rook b8, even though there are some weaknesses in black's camp, and I do have more space, at least black's pieces start to find some life on the dark squares. Now, one thing you do have to watch out for is this move e5. In particular, let's say I do it here, and this bishop and this knight both converge on c6, and that might be something that you don't want to allow, especially if it means that I wind up getting this bishop pair after knight takes e7. So it is something you have to kind of be careful about and consider preparing. You might start with rook b8. Maybe you have to go bishop b7. But at any point, you get the idea that, you know, black does have some ideas after this exchange on d4, even though he's ceding a lot of space. And, you know, white would be better. I mean, I would have knight f5. Again, I would have this e5 idea like I spoke on. But it's just not, it's not like because I secured a takes b6 and a little bit more space on the queen side, the game is over. So anyways, I went c5, and because I thought I could play more directly like this, and the point was again that if d takes c5 is played, I've managed to ruin the structure, and now I can play d takes e5. And the point is, I thought in a structure like this, after knight g4, I thought there might be something tactically advantageous for me. I was debating whether or not I would play e6, this pawn sacrifice, and after f takes e6, you could see all these pawns are kind of nasty and split. I was strongly considering this one, maybe a move like bishop h3, trying to get counterplay like this. I was even considering after knight g4 a move like bishop f4, just protecting this pawn, overprotecting this pawn, and then maybe trying to get some, kicking this knight away to h6, which would be ideal if after I play h3. So there were a lot of dynamic ideas after c5 that really excited me, and I thought, okay, this should be a good way to go. Black wound up playing queen c7, and I must say this was kind of a surprise to me because I didn't think that black could play this way. I thought it'd be quite unnatural to keep this tension, especially when I get a tempo on the queen, and I thought, okay, I must have something here. But it actually wasn't so clear, and the more I started to calculate, it seemed that black was kind of holding up. The first thing that you notice is if you play d takes e5, black can actually just follow up with d takes e5, and the knight and the bishop on d7 and e7 respectively just target my c5 pawn. So it was kind of unclear to me whether or not I can hold this in the long run. I mean, I can play b4 in the immediate term, and I protect it for one move, but black might be able to undermine it with a5. And even though black can't take on b4 right away because I have rook takes a8, black's very next move might be bishop a6, hitting my rook on f1, and then taking on b4. And you can see if once this pawn goes away, my chain on the queen side just totally evaporates. So I was not particularly sold on that. And then the flip side, if I do nothing, black is going to take on d4 and then take on c5. So I thought that I didn't really have anything great just avoiding this. So I figured I needed to play c takes d6 and resolve this tension, which I did. But I wasn't happy with it because it seemed like black managed to secure this blockade on the dark squares. And after bishop takes d6, I thought for a while, trying to figure out whether I should slow play the position or sort of play directly. So the ways I could slow play it, one way would be rook e1 because, again, the knight and the rook on e8 are both hitting e4, so I'm kind of overprotecting it, which is sometimes good. So that was one way I could do it. Another way I thought I could play h3, which is always a useful move to stop knight g4 stuff and bishop g4 stuff down the line. And also after h3, it also has the benefit of preparing bishop e3 because my bishop really would love to develop and connect those rooks. Another idea was even something like queen c2, just protecting the pawn like so, also protecting b2 so that the bishop on c1 can go somewhere later, and in some lines, keeping an eye on the queen on c7. There might be some tactical opportunities with knight b5 or knight d5 if the bishop on d6 moves off of that diagonal. So there were a bunch of candidate moves here, but I wasn't convinced any of them really got me a lot. And so I think one of the things I was really concerned about is I thought black could just proceed with a move like rook b8 and start to get some counterplay with rook b8 and a5 and bishop a6. And I wasn't sure whether or not I had enough useful moves to keep the game meaningful. So I thought, let's say rook b8, h3, a5, maybe rook e1 perhaps, bishop a6, bishop e3. I mean, I guess white is still better for sure because I have a little bit more space in the center and, my pieces are reasonable, but I just wasn't sure how to break through, in particular because neither side really wants to capture on d4. If I capture, on e5, if I capture on e5, then he gets a knight takes e5 and his pieces get active. And I thought if he takes, then my knight comes to d4 and I might have knight f5. So it was just a tricky position. One thing I was concerned about too, by the way, was in a potential scenario like this, the c4 square would become very sensitive. And so you see the rook bearing down on b2 and the knight coming to c4. Not only would my e3 bishop be hit, but also my b2 pawn. So this was another thing I was kind of concerned about, and I didn't love this knight coming to e5 in a lot of lines. So after thinking about all of these different things, I actually, instead of playing queen c2 or h3 or rook e1, well, what did I do? After c takes queen takes, well, okay, I started with queen c2, but after rook b8, I wound up playing rook d1. And my point is that I need to get something going on the d line very quickly before black consolidates. Black wound up playing c5, challenging my pawn on d4, and I thought this was extremely double-edged because it seemed strange to me to allow me to go d5 and lock up the center and get a protected pass pawn. But one thing that came to my attention was that if I play d5, black can go c4, and this knight on c5 would have counterplay on b3 or d3, and I didn't love that, in addition to eyeing the e4 square. So I thought that even though I have this protected pass pawn here, black can play knight c5 and bishop d7 and be quite active on the queen side, now that my b pawn is kind of a backward pawn as long as black can just take with en passant. So I didn't love these structures, and I wasn't sure where my play was coming from. So in this position, I kind of was like, oh man, this is not going exactly the way I wanted to go, and I decided to be a little bit radical, and I went d takes c5, knight takes e5, and rook takes d6. Rook takes d6 on the face of it looks like a really brilliant move, or a move that is just really, really strong. On the flip side, it's not as strong as it looks. I'm getting rid of this dark square bishop because I think it will soften up some of the dark squares that black has in this position. And in actual fact, I'm going to recover the exchange after bishop f4. So it's just a little bit of a tactic to trade some pieces and maybe get to an endgame where I might be a little bit better, because I was really wary of this knight coming to c4. So after rook takes d6, knight takes f3 check was played first. That is important because if you play queen takes d6 right away, now you have a bit of a problem because I have knight takes e5, and if queen takes e5, I have bishop f4 winning back a whole rook, so then I'd just be up a piece. And then if the alternative to taking on e5 with the queen would be rook takes e5, but now after bishop f4, you actually are in a heavy piece skewer where the queen actually needs to stay protected at e5, and I can get rook d1, and I might win back my exchange with interest. So very important to play knight takes f3 check first, which was what he did, because after bishop takes f3, he keeps the pieces in the skewer to a minimum, which is just 2. So after queen takes d6, I do go bishop f4, but you can see the difference here. The rook is still on e8 instead of on e5, which would be a very ugly sight. So now black can save the rook with rook b8, or at least get the material back. And I pretty much am obliged to take. And I go bishop takes b8 and queen takes b8. And the dust is settled here. The material is equal, but I have a little bit more space in the center with my pawn on e4 and my knight on c3 and bishop on f3. And I have one less pawn island than black, right? My pawn structure is a little bit better. I have 2 pawn islands. White has 3 because of these split pawns. So I thought this basically mean it would be a slight advantage to white. But on the flip side, black is very active. In particular, the dark squares b4 and d4 are very sensitive. e5 is also a nice potential outpost for black's pieces. And I honestly don't think white is significantly better, but it's just a tiny edge that I was hoping to sort of squeeze against my lower-rated opponent. So after queen takes b8, I went knight a4, training my eyes setting my eyes on that weakness right away. And I thought that was a nice way to play, because if my knight gets to c5, I also am indirectly protecting the e4 pawn. So I thought that was pretty important. Black went knight d7, which I think is a good move, protecting the c5 pawn, so that if I do decide to take multiple times, black could take on b2. And after knight takes e5, knight takes, queen takes, if this happened, this did not happen. After queen takes b2, this position is very, very close to a draw, and it's hard to imagine that I could even pretend to try and win this one, because even if I win the a6 pawn for free, which I shouldn't, the 4 versus 3 should be a draw. So if you just think about the king side. So really, with black being active and still holding on to an a6 pawn, there's just no way, no reasonable way you should consider this position something that I could win. And another thing to think about is the light squares on the king side are kind of sensitive. So black could even consider a move like bishop h3 and have some mating ideas on the back rank. So all in all, not an ideal set of trades. So instead, after knight d7, I went bishop e2. And my idea with bishop e2 was to prophylactically defend against knight e5, which would have hit my bishop, but to also consider reinforcing my e4 pawn by playing f3. And the point with f3 is that even though I'd weaken some dark squares in my camp, particularly the f2, e3, and d4, there's no dark squared bishop, so I didn't think it'd be as big a deal. And if I'm able to set up f3, perhaps this bishop on c8, which most naturally would want to go to b7, would be very restricted by my pawns. So I've actually mentioned this before, that in some positions you actually want the pawns around your king to be set up on the same color as your opponent's bishop, because it restricts its activity on that side of the board. And this was no different. So I was thinking about bishop e2, f3, rook d1, and just playing with just restricting black's activity and maybe having something to play for in the ending. Black played queen e5, attacking the e4 pawn, and I went knight c3 back, which I thought was pretty good, because now that the knight on d7 was effectively defending c5, and I managed to force it to a defensive square, I thought it was time to bring my knight back to new prospects. The other thing is, if I go f3 now, which I spoke about like ad nauseum a moment ago, I was a little bit wary of queen e5 check, or queen d4 check as a move, and sometimes even f5. So let's say like queen d4, king g2, f5 here, and I don't know. Actually, here it's not a problem because my queen is protecting the bishop. So maybe let's back up and go f5 first. And you can see I can't go e takes f5 because queen takes e2 hangs a piece. I could go bishop c4 check, but I was unclear after king h8 still whether this was a good series or not, because after e takes f5, there is queen e3 check and maybe even knight e5 next. So still a very complicated position. I was unsure of the consequences of this f5 push, so I just thought it's a little bit safer to bring my knight back. So after knight c3, queen e6 was played. I think queen e6 defends, overprotects a6, which was also attacked now that I brought the knight back, so that makes some sense. And now I went f3, and I solidified my structure, and now I really was not remotely concerned about f5 because my knight is protecting e2 in addition to my queen, and I'm just sort of keeping everything together. And I must say here, in the past 5 to 6 moves, I was quite happy with the transformation. It seems that black has kind of floundered with his pieces, just reacting to my threats against the pawns. And in the meantime, I've managed to get really, really nice coordination in my setup. Notice that the knight and the bishop are really doing a great job, and this bishop potentially might go to c4 one day, which would be a really nice diagonal to work with. So I thought I was really doing a nice job just sort of getting everything ready to play like rook d1 or queen d2 and infiltrate. So anyways, after f3, black went bishop b7, and this is not something I minded at all because, again, this bishop is now biting on granite here, so not a problem. And I went rook d1, now setting my sights on trying to invade on the one open file. I was already thinking about rook d1, queen d2, and even queen d6, trading queens. Because now this bishop is so ineffectual, I thought with a queen trade I can play maybe king f2 or king e3 and really start to loosen the screws a bit. So I was getting very excited here. After rook d1, Black went h5 though, and I think this was a very, very good move, and it kind of confused me a little bit because it basically distracted me from what I was trying to do. Now again, what I was trying to do was go queen d2 and then queen d6, right? So let's say g6 was played. I'd go queen d2, the knight would have to move somewhere, and then queen d6. And I'm invading, and I'm very active, and you could see just trading the queens would mean my rook could infiltrate in black side of the board, and just be kind of problematic. What h5 does is it say, hey, I have my own plans. I'm going to go h4, loosen the screws on your king side, and maybe knight e5 will come later at some point, and you're not going to really want to play f4 because then that opens up this bishop on the diagonal. So this knight will be very active there, and also the c4 square will stop bishop c4 plans from happening, and I'm going to be very, very active here. And I was concerned about this. The h5 really, really bothered me. I went knight d5, shifting gears, because I thought now would be a responsible time to try and invade and get my own counterplay going before this pawn rolls. And I thought by putting the knight on d5, I was forcing an exchange that would be favorable for me, the knight for the bishop. But on the flip side, it's kind of clear that this bishop is pretty restricted, and you could argue I could have continued with queen d2. Let's say after queen d2, knight e5, I could still consider a move like queen d6 and maybe try and force the trade of queens. Although I must say it's not obligatory, and he might deny it. He might go queen b3, attack b2. He might even consider a move like queen h3 and try and get something going here. But I think this queen d2, queen d6 maneuver might have been the safest thing, because my knight d5 maneuver kept the queens on the board, and he's still trying to run with his h-pawn, which could soften up my king side. So knight d5 is actually a good move, but in hindsight, it might have not been the easiest way to play, or the safest way. Black took on d5. I think that makes sense. I was threatening knight c7 forking, and this bishop on b7 was not so hot anyway. The other thing with knight d5 is also threatening knight f4 sometimes, hitting the queen and the pawn on h5. So it was a really good multi-purpose move. Anyways, bishop takes d5, rook takes, and my rook is active, which is great. And I was thinking in an ideal world, I might be able to play bishop c4 and get some battery going on f7. But you can really see that if this knight comes to e5, I'm not really getting in bishop c4. And yeah, it was a tough thing to think about. So h4 happened, and here is again, a real annoying distraction, because you could see here that h takes g3 is an option, but also h3 is an option sometimes, creating that thorn pawn, which makes my king a little bit airy on the back rank. Now, I played a move that I think is not particularly accurate, even though it is. I think the computer is fine with it. I played g takes h4. I think it would have been a little bit safer to go king g2. The reason being is that I just shore up the g3 pawns, that if he captures, I take back and I keep my pawn structure, the integrity on my king side. But the flip side is that if he goes h3 check, which you might consider to be logical, my king can step over to f2, and the point is that this h3 pawn is a short-term strength but a long-term weakness. And with it being on the light square, I might be able to corral it with bishop f1 once I take the queens off the board. So I think this would have been a little bit better way to play, just because I keep my king side pawn structure intact and I still keep a safe king. Whereas after g takes h4, which I played, my king is a little bit airy here, even though I have an extra pawn. So I was banking on the fact that this wouldn't be a problem, but it actually turned out to be a problem. Black went queen h3, trying to seize on that pawn right away. And I was happy to see this, because it was clear to me that, the queen was not, going to be able to checkmate me alone. And so I didn't think going in for it right away made a lot of sense, honestly. I thought it would have been a little bit more natural to, consider something else. Maybe rook b8, trying to get the rook active, or knight f6, attacking my rook on d5. Something a little bit more active. I thought I was a little bit surprised by queen h3 because you're not even threatening to take this pawn because the d7 knight is hanging. So I was a bit pleasantly surprised to see that. And here I had an opportunity to take advantage of that, and I did not. I played queen c3, but why don't you take a minute and pause the video and try to figure out the best way to play this one. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and try and figure out the right way to go. The best move here is actually queen d2. And the point is that you're actually attacking the knight right away with 2 pieces. And after you force the knight away, now queen f4 protects this pawn, and also it tries to go queen g3 to force a queen trade. The point is that after knight g6, I go queen g3 and I force the queens off, and black winds up recovering the pawn. But this type of ending where the material is equal would favor white slightly. I mean, it's not winning or anything, but it's a good winning attempt. C5 is hanging, the a6 pawn is hanging, and black needs to just try and get counterplay because this knight on h4 is a little bit out of the way. So after a move like rook b8, I go king g3, hit the knight. After rook takes b2, bishop c4, and the point is here, instead of taking on a6 right away, I think about going rook d7 and taking on f7 and trying to get a scenario where I get a 3 versus 1 on the king side. In many instances, these pawns here that are isolated are kind of weak and aren't going anywhere, so I don't have to rush to take them. And a position like this could be quite promising for white if I'm able to go rook c7 and bishop c4 and set that up. Now, this is closer to a draw than it is to a win, but it just would have been a little bit better try than what I did because I kind of allow the queen to kind of stay alive, and again, my king is very airy. So anyways, I went queen c3, and now knight f8 was played, and now I went rook g5, and this was my idea, was I thought, okay, with my queen on c3 and my rook on g5, I'm actually threatening mate, and I thought that would be a huge, huge thing. And it turns out it was because of my opponent's mistake here, but the best move in the position would have been knight e6. And the point is, after knight e6, he effectively defends this mate, right, on g7, and he also eyes a new outpost for his knight on d4, which would block out my queen on c3 and eye the e2 and f3 pieces that are on those squares. So huge, huge problem for me if knight e6 was played. Instead, after rook g5, knight g6 was played, and this position is actually winning, but I miss it. I miss the way to finish the game. So here's another actual opportunity to pause the video and try and figure out the best way to play. White to move and win. All right, this one is a tricky one, so don't be super surprised if you miss it. But the move that wins the game is actually bishop c4. And bishop c4 is an amazing move because it creates several different threats. The first thing you need to see is that there's rook takes g6 as an idea, right? If rook takes g6, f takes g6 is no longer possible because the bishop is holding that pawn in place. That's the one threat. The issue with it is that it's not easy to parry because if the king moves away, well, then I just take the f7 pawn and skewer the knight and the rook, right? Okay. The flip side is if you can't move the knight on g6 anywhere meaningful because then I actually have checkmate. And note that the one square that blocks my queen on the diagonal, I'm still controlling the knight with 2 pieces, so that's impossible. So how do you deal with this threat? What are the options? Well, one thing I thought about was king f8. Well, how do you deal with this? And I thought, okay, when I was calculating during the game, I was like, well, king f8, doesn't that hold everything together? Well, actually, white is still winning because of the tactic bishop takes f7. And the point is that after king takes f7, rook f5 check, there's actually a really beautiful mate if the king goes back. If king g8, I have queen c4 check, and note the king can't come back to f8. And if king h7, rook h5 mate. And this knight is blocking black from having an escape square on the g file. So it's just checkmate, amazing mate. And then the flip side is if the king has to go the other way towards the e file, now I can start checking and taking pawns with check, and this would be decisive because ultimately I take a pawn with check, I come back, and then I challenge the king again, and the king will have to be pushed out and mated very quickly. So amazing resource, this bishop takes f7, but that is a detail I missed. Now, another thing I think is worth worrying about, and I think I probably was worried about it, was this move rook d8. Because, yeah, I have this rook takes g6 idea, but what about rook d1? Isn't that dangerous? Doesn't that mean the king has to come out, and then queen takes h2 is possible? Well, it turns out it's not so dangerous. After rook takes g6, rook d1 check, my king does have to run, but it actually runs to safety. If queen takes h4, king e3, rook e1, king d3, rook d1, and king c2, and you can see I still have this pin, and I'm still threatening mate, and the king just runs towards the queen side, amazingly. And there's really no recourse for black. I mean, if queen takes h2, the same, here it actually loses faster because now I can block with the rook. And if queen takes h4 here, I have king e2, and there are actually no more checks because my queen is guarding the important e1 square, which would be mate otherwise. So anyways, a tough line to see, in general, but especially if you're in some time trouble, which I was. And yeah, I just missed it. Instead, I decided to be very defensive, but at this moment, it was not the time to do that. And I went rook g3, challenging the queen, because I thought at least I'd get the queen away from the line of sight of my king. But after queen takes h4, well, I'm not winning anymore, and black has recovered an important pawn. I went bishop takes a6, trying to take the a6 pawn and just remain up a pawn, but this is actually a mistake. Instead, I should have played queen takes c5, and the position would have remained equal. Black could still go knight f4 here, and after bishop f1, I actually, in a practical game, would prefer to be white, but only barely, because you see this knight is super active right now. Now it happens to be that my bishop is controlling all the squares the knight can go to, but my king is very, very airy here, and I just have to take care to really avoid some type of initiative happening. One thing that would concern me would be rook d8, and then coming on with rook d2, and it's already hard to defend the second rank and the pawn on h2. So a very difficult position, and I was very concerned. I went bishop takes a6, and it turns out that queen h6 was not a great move, but black could have gone for rook a8 and gone rook a1 check, and again gotten very active on the a file. So anyways, rook g3, queen takes h4, bishop takes a6, queen h6. Queen h6 does defend the mate on g7 and frees up the knight to move, but not the most tenacious. Rook a8 was better. And now I went bishop c4, but you actually can see here that bishop c4 is like 3 or 4 moves too late, because g7 is amply protected, so the knight's actually free to move. And the knight didn't move right away. He actually went rook d8, which is kind of, saying, I'm going to try and be as active as possible. I actually thought knight e5 was going to be the move, or even knight f4, but he decided to go rook d8. After rook d8, I have new problems because I have to deal with rook d1 as an idea. I also have to deal with queen d2 as an idea. So I have a whole lot of problems. It's like the Jay-Z song, 99 Problems. I have quite a few here. I went bishop d5, blocking this rook on the d file. And I was happy to make this move because it also prevents rook a8, which is something I would have been concerned about earlier, because now my bishop is actually controlling that square. But still, now knight f4 comes, and this bishop is not very secure. Now here, knight f4 is a very, very powerful move and should kind of kill the game, because in addition to hitting d5, there's also this family fork on e2, which would just bust up everything. And it's quite clear that I'm kind of in a world of pain here. But I decided to gamble a little bit because my opponent was down to his last minute, and I thought we were heading to move 40. And my rationale was if we actually wind up getting to move 40 and he has time to think, there's just no way I'm winning this game. My king is too weak. He's going to figure out a way to hold everything together and to deal with my one-move threats. And, it could be, I even thought I could lose this game. I mean, my king is so weak. So I thought, you know what, I need to take a chance now while he's in the time trouble to mix it up and confuse. And I did that with Queen A5. Now, Queen A5 is not the best move, and is not the move that I even was not even my first choice, honestly. But I thought it was the best move to sort of ruffle feathers. The safest move would be Queen takes C5, allowing Knight E2. And the point is that after Knight E2 check, I can go King G2, and after Knight takes H takes, I have 2 pawns for the exchange, and my king is relatively secure. So it's hard to imagine that black has anything better than a draw. After like Queen D2, King H3, there could be some repetition, but it's hard to imagine that there would be more than that because my bishop is hitting F7, which is a weak spot, and it's hard for this rook to get active on a open file because my bishop is blocking this file. It's controlling A8, so it's controlling the A file, and my queen is controlling the C file. So it's hard to imagine the rook getting very active. So I thought that this was the way to go if I wanted a draw, but I didn't want a draw. I wanted more. So I went Queen A5 and gambled a little bit. Black now went Rook D6, trying to just defend this rook. A little bit better move would have been Queen F6. That would have been a very, very strong move because in addition to defending the rook on D8, you also create your own threats with Queen D4 check and getting in on my very, very weak king, which has no shelter, and the knight is really controlling a lot of important squares. And this would have been the way to really, really put the pressure on me. It turns out I could still hold this game. I could go Queen takes C5 and Knight E2 and King G2. But this line is a little bit different than the other line where I could give up the exchange because here he actually gets the B2 pawn. And after King H3, it's still closer to a draw than a win for black, but practically speaking, it could be hard to defend. After a scenario like Queen F6, F4, just to push that pawn, and G6, there could be some real danger now because now this rook can actually activate on the H file. So let's say a King G7 comes and then Rook H8, that could be kind of powerful. So I was even looking at a line where after Queen C7, King G7, and Queen C7 stops the rook from getting in on B8. There's actually Rook H8 threat now, and there's a crazy move King G4, which kind of gets out of the way of that check. And we might kind of have some dynamic equality where my king is kind of snug on G4, shielded from checks, and this queen on F6 is tied to the F7 pawn. So it's hard to imagine that it can get active to try and bother me, and we might just have an equal position here. But just kind of illustrates the dynamics in the position and pretty much where black should have gone. But again, he was playing on second. So instead he went Rook D6. And this gave me just the ammo I needed because now I played Queen C7 and I had one really tricky threat which my opponent missed. Now it turns out here this is still a position that is drawn. So perhaps you should, if you want, you can pause the video and try and figure out black to play and draw because this position is still drawn. All right, so hopefully you got a chance to pause the video. One way that black could have just ended the game was by playing Knight takes D5. Or excuse me, not Knight takes D5, Knight H3. And the point is that after Rook takes H3, which I would try to do because if Queen takes H3, I win the Rook on D6, right? So fair enough. After Rook takes H3, the Queen can't recapture on H3, but instead goes Queen C1 check. And the issue is I actually can't get out of the checks. After King G2, Queen D2, I have to stay like this because moving up the board with king g3 would actually lead to checkmate in 2 on h4 or on g5. So I really could not step up the board, and I'd have to, deal with this perpetual. So knight h3 would have drawn on the spot. Fortunately for me, black played knight takes d5, and this was exactly what I was looking for because I had a devilish trap, which was the move queen c8 check. Not recovering the knight on d5, but introducing my own idea, which is that after king h7, I have rook h3, and amazingly, the queen is actually lost because the rook is covered. So it was actually a hard move to see when you're in time trouble, I think, because the queen is protecting it from so far away, but he probably should have saw it. And unfortunately for him, it just spells the end because, the queen versus the rook and knight are sufficient, especially when there's still enough pawns on the board where black can't set up any meaningful blockade. Black wound up playing knight f4, trying to just move this knight because I was threatening to take on with check on the king and then take the knight, so he had to move the knight. But now I can play rook takes h6, and after g takes h6, I went queen f5 check, and you can see the knight is loose and the pawn on f7 is loose, and you can't hold everything together. If you go knight g6, I take on f7, and that's another very important pawn near the black king, and having these two connected pawns will mean that I win the game. Instead, black went for rook g6 check, which is a nice move, blocking a check with a check, but after king f1, he's still tied up in a pretzel. Now the rook is pinned, and the queen is still attacking f7 and the f4 knight. So after king f1, we'd actually reached the time control, and my opponent resigned. So, very, very shaky time trouble sequence for me. I think it all kind of started with this h4 move, or this h5 move, and then h4, kind of distracting me from my consolidating, which was what I was trying to do. I was going for like the slow squeeze, and then all of a sudden there wasn't the same one-way traffic. And I think the opening was kind of insightful as well. You can get a sense of all the different plans that can happen in these perk type of positions. And there are many different ways to set up, but I think black was relatively solid, and I didn't have any clear way to break through. So definitely was just a tough game. But happy to get the W, happy to move on and win my second game in a row. All right, thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.